Okay, let's talk about psychology. You can't really have a counseling conference without talking about psychology, but I'm always afraid to talk about this one because it's the one that makes people angry. And, we'll just have some counseling about anger. So, O Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth. You have set your glory above the heavens. Out of the mouth of babies and infants you have established strength because of your foes, to still the enemy and the avenger. When I look at your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you've set in place, what is man that you are mindful of him, and the son of man that you care for him? Psalm 8, 1-4. So as we've been talking about all the way along, the goal as Christians is to glorify God in all that we think, feel, do, and say. Another word for glory is fame. We haven't said that before, but it's really what it is. When you think about it, you think of athletes or actors and actresses and those kind of things, and you think of how they get glory, and they get glory by being famous. And sometimes they get glory even when they're infamous. They do something evil or sinful or just vile, and they get publicity out of it, and they become famous. We know about people because they're in trouble all the time, or we know about people because they're wonderful. Another interesting thing I think about this is, as a few years ago we got to go to Europe and visit a bunch of places. My in-laws are not Christians, but we went to a bunch of churches and things. We went to the Vatican. We went to all through churches all over Italy and other places, and we went and saw a lot of cool things. But one of the things you always notice is that they have pictures of saints, and they always have halos. The halo is glory. That's what it is. It's that there's a spotlight on them, and the glory is there, and they're becoming famous with their glory. So glory and fame, I think, are really tied together. Glory means more than that, but it doesn't mean less than that. So we're making God famous. That's what we talk about him all the time with people. We talk about Jesus all the time. We're making him famous in all of that, and that's what glory is. So, and we do this in many ways. We praise him for who he is and what he's done. We talk to him all the time without ceasing, and the Bible says every situation we study him through his word and his creation. Every chance we get, we talk about him with other people. As Christians, we study life, all of life, so that we can bring it under the lordship of Jesus Christ. Therefore, this conference is about how to use the Bible to help others to walk with God and to become more mature in Christ as they do. So in other talks, and even in the last hour, I mentioned that oftentimes people have their life, and then they have Jesus. And they want to try and figure out how to fit Jesus into their life. And when it comes to the area of counseling, the church, at least in my lifetime, has traditionally done things like, you have the church over here, and you have problems in your life with living, how to live with other people, and how to live with yourself, and how to do things, and how to function. And if you have difficulties that aren't specifically in the Bible, at least on the surface, you send them to a professional. You send them to a psychologist or a psychiatrist, because they have all the answers about how to behave and how to live and stuff. And they even have names for those things. So and we are so into that we don't even notice that we do it. And we do it, and almost all of us do it. So here's a little quiz for you. What do you call a person who drinks all the time? They drink alcohol all the time, by all the time I mean they have a sip at lunch, and they have a beer for breakfast, and they have a big glass of wine for supper, and they go to the bars and hang out with their friends on the weekends, and they do it so much that they eventually they lose their families and their jobs, and then they're sitting on the street corner, and they're drinking, and they have a bottle of beer or whiskey or something in the bag, and they have a cup that says "Feed me." What do we call that person? How many of you thought alcoholic? Okay, so how do you help an alcoholic? We send him to AA, or we send him to some other kind of a rehab place or something like that, right? Okay, so where in the Bible, I was going to hold up my Bible, but I have my iPad. Where in the Bible does it use the word alcoholic? Is it possible to help an alcoholic in a biblical way? the answer really is no. That's why the first thing we think of is we have to send them to a rehab place or to a psychologist or something, right? You can't help an alcoholic. Well, what if we change the word to drunk? How many of you thought he was a drunk? How many of you heard me give this illustration before? But if we use the word drunk instead of the word alcoholic, how would we help him? If it's the word drunk, if he's a drunk, is there a biblical way to help him? There is, right? There are biblical things. The Bible talks about drunkenness. The Bible talks about sin. It talks about repentance. It talks about fellowship. It talks about what you might do to help somebody who is a drunk. But if we use the word alcoholic, we have no clue. We're just lost. Or to use another example, what do you call it when you have a young lady who's 20 years old and she stops eating? And she hasn't eaten for weeks. And she comes to dinner with her family and she nibbles at her supper and then she runs to the bathroom and throws up, makes herself throw up. And she's always talking about how fat she is, and she's losing weight like a crazy woman. She's lost 20 pounds in the last 2 months, and she's just a rail. What do you call that? What? Anorexia. Yeah. Okay, so how do you help her? You go see a doctor. Go put her in a hospital somewhere where they can treat her. What? But not generally if she's an anorexic. Because anorexia makes your brain go out of the biblical world and into the psychological world. And since we're not professionals, we don't know how to deal with that, right? But if you say, let's talk about it biblically. She's not eating. She's got other things going on. And it's not the eating part, it's the self-centered part. It's the thoughts about what she thinks about herself and what she thinks about God and Christ and stuff. And now we have biblical things we can do to help her. So in here I have a person who has, is it ADHD that it is? I think I lost myself in my notes. Yeah, but your pages are different than my pages. Oh, I know what happened. I bonked my screen and lost the page. Anyway, there are symptoms that people who have ADHD, they have these particular symptoms that are the reasons why the person who gives them the diagnosis would call it ADHD. But each one of those symptoms are biblical things. There are things talked about in the Bible, and I can't find it on my page here. I had it a minute ago. It's the second paragraph of your problems with psychology section. Oh, there we are. Yeah. Oh, okay, so your child gets bored easily, becomes listless, can't concentrate, regularly acts out. He's more than... So you have these symptoms. He's bored easily, he's listless, he can't concentrate, he regularly is getting in trouble because he's doing crazy things. You have this list of symptoms, and if you take him to a professional, they give him a diagnosis of what he, generally speaking, in the psychological world, it's not something he has, it's something that he's exhibiting. So it's not. So we often lay people types would say he has ADHD, but in the psychology world, they wouldn't say that he has it. It's just he's exhibiting it, something like that. So, but each one of those things are things that we can talk about in a biblical way, without that label, and help the person who's doing all of those individual symptoms. So I got ahead of myself, a lot ahead of myself here. But anyway, that's kind of an illustration of how the two different worlds work. They're two different worlds. Biblical counseling and psychology are two different worlds. And I want to really emphasize that, because I want to also say that they can't get mixed. They don't mix well. They don't play well together. And people try it all the time, and one of the things we're going to talk about is a bunch of people who do try it. And in fact, there's a big list at the end of people who do. So our goal is Christians. So there's two streams. About a decade before Jay Adams began his quest to make the Bible the foundation and guide for all counseling, Christian people who were trained in non-Christian psychology began to see that the church was lacking in the proper care of souls. Churches were either not teaching the Word of God because they were liberal, or they were teaching a different gospel because they believed that eschatology trumped living in the world as we've been given, dispensationalists, or because they simply taught theology and assumed that people would be able to apply it in their lives without any kind of training. So fundamentalists and Reformed. Now, when I was living in Dexter, Missouri, we went to lunch after church at a restaurant, and this family came in, and they were all excited and chipper, and I swung my chair around, and I stood up, I can't remember. Anyway, I was talking with one of the girls, high school girl, and I said, "So you guys been to church?" And she said, "Yeah." And I said, "So how was it?" And she said, "Oh, it was wonderful." And I said, "So what was the message about?" And she said, "Oh, it was about the gospel of the last days." And I said, what is the gospel of the last days? And she looked at me really funny, and she said, "You don't know?" And I said, "No." And she said, "Huh." And she turned around and ignored me. She wouldn't talk to me anymore. It was just so bizarre. But I know what she was saying. I know what she was talking about. It's that we've got to get ready for the rapture. And she was all excited about it, so that was kind of good. But anyway, there's this big gap in the church, there's a hole in the care of souls in the church. So you have the liberal people on one side, you have the people who preach the gospel every Sunday, and that's all there is, so that when you die, you get to go to heaven. And then you have the Reformed folks on the other end who are really into the seriousness of theology, and it's just all about the nuts and bolts of it. It's not about how you apply it in your life. And so there's this big hole about how do you actually live with all of this going on. And into that gap, into that void, came folks who were studying, who had the view that we need to study psychology so that we can help people. And they're not doing that. So we had all these guys go off to college and study psychology and become psychologists, and who were Christians, and they came back into the church to try and minister to the folks that were left out by their pastors. So they believed the gospel, but thought that they had discovered truth about human behavior in their professional disciplines, and sometimes even in their churches. And often pastors are this way too. A lot of pastors won't do counseling because they need to see professionals, and they'll send them off to other places. We even have pastors in our own denomination who do that. But I think that's sinful, and we'll talk about why. So it didn't bother them, and maybe they didn't know, but you don't have to read these guys very long, Freud and Jung and Rogers and Skinner and Adler and all these other guys. You don't have to read them for very long to see that they weren't Christians. They're the foundation of our modern view of psychology. There's some guys before Freud that did psychology, but they're not as well known. And everybody's kind of based on or reacts to Freud. So they're either Freudian in that they like him, or that they're Freudian in one sense because they don't like him. So we have all of that around. I have two big old honkin' books at home about why Freud was wrong. And I don't know why, I haven't read them yet. But so people are either liking Freud or they're not liking Freud, but either way, Freud is at the center. But they're not. But those guys also, not only were they not Christians, they were also anti-Christian. They were doing what they were doing to give an alternative to the gospel, to give an alternative to biblical things. And again, you don't have to read them very far to see that that's true. Just pick up a book, a lot of their illustrations and things are about why Christianity is wrong and why it's bad. And some of them, even in the modern psychological world, they have treatments and therapy to help you get away from Christianity, because that's a binding, enslaving, manipulative kind of system, and it's actually a thing that you need therapy for, because that's bad that you're a Christian. Before I go too much further, let me say this. I'm not talking about all psychology, I'm just talking about counseling psychology. And here's why. So, have you ever noticed that when you go to a really nice restaurant, it's really dark, and the colors in the place are dark browns and just darkish colors? And then when you go to a fast food restaurant, the colors are really bright and cheerful and chipper, and they're red and orange and green and yellow and all that kind of stuff. Well, there are psychologists out there who've studied that, colors and how they impact people, so that a restaurant, a fine restaurant, the nicer the restaurant, the darker the colors often, is because they want you to stay there and enjoy yourself. And the colors soothe you. They're soothing colors, and they get in your head, and you like being here. And well, we can stay here all night, and let's bring a pillow next time. And this is really nice. And so the colors keep you. The colors at the fast food restaurants initially invite you because you like bright colors. That's cool. But they irritate you after a while, and you don't want to stay there. So you go in, you get your stuff, and then you leave. And nobody really thinks about it, but you never really say, hey, let's hang out here. You don't go, let's have coffee at McDonald's and hang out for an hour, because the colors mess with your brain and you want to get out, and you don't really think about it that way, but that's what's happening. That kind of thing I think is cool. Or another one, I just put this on my Facebook the other day. There's this little box, and it said, everybody reads this line first, and then the next line down, and then we go to this line, and then you go to this line, and then you go up to this line, and maybe and then you notice this thing, and then finally you'll look at here. And it was exactly what I did. I read the big one, the one in the middle, and then I just followed it exactly like it said, even though, it said that's what you're going to do in the process, but I thought, why did I go in that order? And I don't know why. But that's the thing that psychologists notice. They notice stuff like that, and they study stuff like that, and I think that's kind of cool. What I'm talking about is one of the things David Powlison pointed out is that psychologists in general, even counseling psychologists, are really good at describing things. They're just not good at explaining things. The reason they're good at describing things because they're good at observing things. They do their experiments that put a bunch of people in a room and watch what they do and throw stuff plunk things in the middle and watch what they do, and they do stuff, and so they describe what happened. It's just when they try to explain why what they saw happened, they get off the track. And it's because their worldview is upside down and on its head. So I think that down the road someday, somewhere, it could be possible for a bunch of Christians to get together with the Christian worldview behind everything and ignore anything that they get from psychology and do these same kinds of experiments. And because they have a biblical worldview, because they view man in a particular way and God in a particular way and Scripture in a particular way, they could plunk the thing in the middle of the group, and the group reacts to it in the same way they did before, but it'd be a very different explanation for why. But we don't do that. Christians overwhelmingly get into the psychological world, and they become, I don't know if the word would be trapped, they're trapped into that world, and then they see it through the same lens that the psychologists or non-Christian psychologists see it. They're unable, it seems, to see it from a biblical perspective and then explain it that way. So I think I'm talking about counseling psychology, not all psychology in general. So I think that's important to point out. So the Christian psychologists took the principles of non-Christian psychology, baptized them with biblical terminology, and brought the principles into the church as if they had found truth. Consequently, over time, they have led the way to a psychologized church. And we call this kind of ministry Christian counseling or integrationist counseling because it's done by Christians but using non-Christian psychology, or really the world psychology. And I gave you that quiz about alcoholics and anorexics, and really I could have done the same thing with pretty much anything. And you fell into the trap because we all think in categories because our world is very psychologized, and we just live in it, and we don't even know that we are. But here's another reason that this is important, because Ed Welch has a paper, I have it right here, a copy of it right here. It's called A Discussion Among Clergy, Pastoral Counseling Talks with Secular Psychology. And one of the things, and what he's doing in this paper is pointing out that psychology and psychologists are actually another religion. And I think that's important to note, that, and we just saw a little bit of it when we talked about what do you do with an alcoholic, or how do you treat an alcoholic, or how do you minister to an alcoholic is very different than how you minister to a drunk. That's important to know. They're very different. But along with that, definitely goes along with that, is if we talk about alcoholism or drunkenness in terms of religiousness, who or what is the alcoholic worshiping? If we talk about, and it was a liberal theologian that came up with this definition, and I don't remember who it was, and I don't remember that it was when I first heard it, but I kind of like it. Religion is your ultimate concern. Whatever you are ultimately concerned with is your God. So if you're concerned with Jesus, you're a Christian. If you're concerned with Yahweh in a different kind of way, you're maybe Jewish. Or if you're concerned with Muhammad and Allah, you're a Muslim. If you're concerned with psychology, you're a psychologist. But and I think there are lots of little gods in there. And so we have all these little gods, and then we have God. And so what I think we're trying to do is we have all these little gods, and then we try to stick God in with our other gods. And I haven't talked about it this way before, but that's really what we're doing. We have our life, and then we're trying to stick Jesus in with our life. Well, what's the God of a person who drinks all the time? What's the focus of his life? Well, yeah, ultimately, right. But what's he worshiping? Right, but so how's he worshiping it? Yeah, so if you had a little idol on your counter, let's say I made my iPad my God, and I sit it there, really I'm worshiping me, because it's really about me, right? But I'm calling this my God, because I'm focused on this. I care for it, I clean it, I make sure it's charged, I make sure I have the latest apps. It's a focus of my life. I leave it at home and I call my daughter, or my wife passed away, so I don't call her anymore. But I used to call my wife and say, how's my iPad doing? You keeping it clean? Is it nice and warm and not too cold? My iPad is my God, right? I mean, it's really about me. You're totally right. But it's the thing I put on the altar and pretend to worship. In alcoholism, alcohol is the God. I spend all my time thinking about it, or this guy spends all his time thinking about it. He goes and drinks it. He hangs out with other people who drink it. They even have songs to it that they drink. Oh, the barn. They're singing their alcohol songs in the bars. If they don't get it, they go a little bit nuts. They got to have it. There's a sense in which that's a physical thing, but it's also a worship thing. I got to have my God. I got to go worship him. He's the center. Alcohol is the center. If you treat it like Alcoholics Anonymous, or Alcoholics Anonymous does, now what's the God? The alcohol is still the God. But we worship the alcohol now by not drinking it. We spend all our time thinking about not drinking it. We go to meetings where we don't drink it. We think about all day long not drinking it. We have, again, the meetings, I don't know if they have songs, but you get little chips for how long you didn't drink it. You get all kinds of stuff. You get a camaraderie, you get fellowship. You go there and you hang out with all your buddies who don't drink it. You talk about not drinking it together. But it's still the center. So in one sense, in the first case, you were bound by the alcohol and it destroyed your life. In the second case, you're bound by alcohol, but it's just a nicer binding. It doesn't destroy your life necessarily, but you don't have any friends who aren't alcoholics. All your friends are worshiping the same God that you do. But it isn't Jesus. And so in the system, if you're an alcoholic, you're not a Christian in the alcoholic system. Even though Alcoholics Anonymous is ostensibly a Christian organization, it isn't a Christian organization. The God who you consider to be God is what you kind of worship, they say. But really, alcohol is still the center. And all psychological counseling therapy is like that. You're not brought closer to God. You're part of the psychological system, and you stay worshiping whatever the thing is you're worshiping. And often you're just not worship. Your worship is to not worship the God rather than to worship the God. You're not indulging in the God. Instead of indulging in the God. So, one of the things about psychology is they want to be a science. They have always wanted to be a science. Now, originally, psychology kind of split off from science, and largely it happened. Different things that you look at historically in the 1840s, and it was interesting. I think that it often happens after a war. So after the Civil War, and in Germany there was some big war that they had, and the psychologists would do things like cut open people's brains and look inside and see what's going on in there, or they take their roots all the way back to Egypt where they do experiments on people's brains. And so there's this connection between psychology and brains, because what you think is in your head, and so we want to see what's going on in there. And there is a sense that that's science, because it's repeatable. You can check stuff out and look in there and poke it, and things happen, and you poke it again and other things happen. And that's repeatable, so that's science. But when it split apart and became more of a how do we help people live kind of a thing, They call it a science, but if you get a science textbook, like a general science textbook, they'll call it a soft science. And the reason it's called a soft science is because in real science, the experiments that they do with things are repeatable. So if a scientist in Australia does a thing with eggs and water, and where it explodes and blows up and flies around the room, and they write it up in a paper, and then they send the paper to a scientist in Maine in the United States, he'll do the same exact experiment, and it'll pop up in the air and fly around the room too. It'll do exactly the same thing in both places because that's science. In psychology, a guy in Australia can do an experiment with a person or a group of people and have a result. He'll write it up in a paper and say, this is wonderful. And then the guy in Maine, a psychologist in Maine, will do the same experiment, but because people are different, it won't work the same way. It might not have the same results at all, maybe completely different, some totally different result. In the scientific community, if the guy in Australia did the thing with the eggs in the water and it did something and he wrote it up, and the guy in Maine did the thing with the eggs in the water and it didn't do what he said, what happened in Australia, that would say it's not right. You did something wrong. It's not working. We reject the whole thing. The water and the egg is not doing what you said. It's not working. In psychology, they just go, oh, huh, and go right on as if it was still true. And it's that way across the board. And so it's not it's not a science because it can't be testable, it can't be falsifiable. There's all kinds of problems with what's going on in the whole system. The whole system is that way. There's one thing that you hear about, I have it mentioned here, serotonin and dopamine and other chemicals in your brain. You go to a psychologist, or you really need to go to a psychiatrist, but somehow psychologists have the ability, even though they're not technically able to do prescriptions, if you have various mental problems, they'll prescribe for you serotonin or dopamine because your brain is lacking or has too much, depending on which thing that you have wrong. And again, that can change if you go to this guy over here or this guy over here. They'll give you different things because I mentioned a minute ago, the symptoms all line up, and then they put a bracket around the symptoms. And if one doctor fits here, the other doctor it might fit here, and another one, sometimes they fit over here, they give you different treatments. But the serotonin and dopamine, which is so popular, and you've probably heard about these, it's untestable. They have not tested how much dopamine or serotonin is in your brain. I know that's weird, isn't it? You think, wait, you're wrong, that's not true. They say all the time. Can you ask a question now? Is that legal? I think it's legal, go ahead. But you have to yell so I can hear you. That's what your friend would say. Yeah, right. So you could say, well, you give. We had, let's say, 20 people who all were having depression problems, and we decided, whoever the we is, I'm not sure how this works, but the we decided that giving them serotonin will get into their brain somehow and help them with their depression. So we'll take the 20 people and we'll give it to them and we'll observe them and see how things go. And let's say 15 of them get well, or they don't have depression anymore. And so we say, oh, it worked. So now we give it to everybody, and that's how it works. But in cases where they've done these trials, when they do a double-blind trial where they give them a placebo instead of the serotonin, they have the same results. So when you look at the tests and stuff and see whether they work this way, you have 20 people. You give half of them serotonin, you give them the other half nothing. It's just a sugar pill. They have the same results for the numbers of people who got healed in both groups. So you don't know whether it's the placebo effect healing people or if it's the serotonin effect that's healing people. And then if you add in their biblical counseling, is God healing them, or is the serotonin healing them, or is the sugar healing them? It's all muddled when you do it that way. So the major thing that I want to point out is that there are no tests for your brain about how much serotonin or dopamine you have in your brain. And you can Google that. And I looked it up last night because I check every time I give this talk, I check again to make sure they haven't come up with something. And there is stuff that it'll say serotonin can be tested with this method or dopamine can be tested with this method. So you look up the article and you keep on reading and you get all the way to the bottom and they say, one of these days we'll be able to use this to test this. And I think, oh, this isn't right. There's something wrong. Yeah.
So I've heard that alcohol produces a lot of dopamine in the brain. It's this calming effect, but tobacco can do the same thing. Nicotine will produce this dopamine, this calming effect. And in some articles I've read is that when you tag team both of these, like tobacco or nicotine will cause a need for alcohol. Alcohol causes a need for more nicotine. And then that person becomes very addicted not to the substance, but to the feeling. So they want this feeling of calmness, and so they're addicted to that feeling because they don't know then how to handle themselves without that flood of calmness or dopamine. Like they cannot control their own anxiety, and so then the feelings is the addiction, not the substance.
Okay. Yeah, okay. But in this, there's a couple of things to notice. If you get that article, highlight the number of times it says may, or might, or could, and maybe even circle the ones that say does or do. But oftentimes, most of the time, the thing, again, what you just described is, again, what I said a minute ago, they're good at describing something, and then they go from the description to an explanation. So the description is people who drink alcohol and smoke cigarettes get calm, right? Then you leave what we've observed to how come it's working that way, and that's all. It may be that they have a lot of serotonin. It may be that they have a lot of dopamine. It may be this. It may be that. It may be the other thing. Or it may be that what they're after really is the feelings. But that's a description again, that they're self-reporting. There's no testing of it. And that's what I'm saying. There's no test for it. They don't give you an injection in the brain and suck out your dopamine, a hunk of your brain to see how much dopamine's in there. And then even if they did, where in your brain are they looking? And can you scan? They're doing more and more stuff with scans. Can they scan your brain and see it? And you can check dopamine and serotonin in your body, but you don't know what the relationship is between your body and your brain because there's a filter there that won't let dopamine and serotonin and other things go through. And it's a protective thing, so it's a good thing. But even what you just described is more of a description than an explanation. It's a description dressed up to look like an explanation. And the thing that's dangerous about the whole thing is that it takes you from thinking biblically to thinking in the psychological religious realm. It's like a person who drinks all the time is an alcoholic, instead of thinking the person who drinks all the time is a drunk. It's like that, and I think I just think it's like a warning thing. So one of the things that he says in here, this is Ed Welch's article. He says therapists are secular clergy, and you think about it. What clergymen are? I should put my glasses on so I can. It's dark up here. He says, all psychological practitioners are dispensing a worldview. And what you just described is a worldview that ignores, so I've said, where's Jesus in all this? He's not in that. He doesn't need to be in that. You don't need Jesus to be in the psychological world. The therapists are heavy with assumptions about who we are, why we do the things we do, and where we are going. This is clergy turf. Perhaps secular clergy who moonlight as scientist practitioners would be a more apt description of clinicians, and it would probably get discussion off to a rousing start. And he goes on and talks about it that way. So, and then he says the psychotherapeutic worldview are unverifiable. You can't test them. You can't check them out. You can't go from one place to another. And that's why you have over 300 different kinds of therapies. Part of it is because they don't do an experiment and say, oh, it didn't work, let's try something different and go on. They say, oh, it didn't work this time, it worked last time, so let's build a thing over that. And so you can get a PhD. That's how you get a PhD, is you do something and it works and you go, oh, that's it, and you describe it and you write a book on it. That's also why the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, is huge. The DSM-3, I had one. I had the 3, the 4, and the 5, and now I have the 5 and the 4. I don't know what happened to the 3. But they're getting bigger and bigger. And what they do is you line up all the symptoms, and then you stick a bracket over it, and you say, this is OCD, this is depression, this is whatever, this is PTSD, this is bipolar disorder, this is schizophrenia. And then you have all these distinct categories, and then there's places where they overlap. So you'll read articles, and people will have bipolar disorder with a manic depressive influence on it or something. It's because the bracket, they have all these symptoms, and the bracket fits over the end of one of them, and then the other, and the end of another one, the other end of another one. So it's all us trying to figure out how to help people, and you have all these things going on in their life, and we in the world view of it says we need to figure out what it is that they are suffering from. They have this problem. So let's see, another one. Therapists rarely examine their faith commitments. They don't think about the fact that psychology is a faith system. It's a system of faith. We believe in it. We go after it. We love it. We're doing it. Another one that I thought was interesting is he says we're after converts. Therapists want conversions. They want people to buy into the system. They want it to join in. And I think some of that is the reason they use words we don't understand, like anorexia. Do you know what nervosa is? Anorexia nervosa? Have you ever looked up what the word nervosa means? It doesn't mean anything. It has no meaning except with anorexia, which means not eating. It's very simple, but if you hear it and you don't know what it means, it's easy to say, oh, there's a big word. And you're sucked into that whole world, because then when you look up anorexia nervosa, you read it in an article that talks about it that way, and the whole article is sucking you into thinking the way that article is thinking, and you become someone like the person that you're hanging out with. And I think overall, at the end of the day, what happens is we become like the people that we hang out with, and psychology actually is a modern day Baal. It's like the Baals of Israel when they went into the land to conquer the land, and the people in the land already had all their gods. They had their household gods and their city gods and their national gods, and they had them all lined up on their altar. Well, they just took Yahweh, one for Yahweh, and they stuck him on the altar with them. And sometimes they took the ark and they stuck their God in the ark, on the ark with God, so they could worship them both together. And psychology is that kind of a God. It's a God that people worship, but God and little g God, psychology, don't really mix together. And so consequently, when you have people who try to put them together, so I have a big list of integrationist psychologists, folks, and this isn't anywhere near complete. Gary Collins on my list, I don't know what page it is for you guys. This is famous and early Christian integrationist psychologist. Gary Collins, I have a book on my shelf back there. He was teaching at Trinity when I was there. And he's a wonderful man, great godly man, loves the Lord. And the book I have of his is like an introduction to counseling. And in the foreword of it, or the introduction of it, it's all full of the gospel and how wonderful God is and the glory of God and just great stuff. And there's scripture everywhere, all over it. And then you turn the page to the first chapter, and that's it for scripture. After that, all the footnotes are psychology, all the comments are psychological, all the descriptions are psychological. Everything is in there. Occasionally there's a reference to the Bible, but it's illustrative, it's not authoritative. He's not taking you back into the church, he's keeping you out into the psychological world. Or you look at, there's Paul Tournier, Swiss psychologist, taught at, he didn't teach at TEDS. Oh, he was influenced by Tournier. So we've probably heard a lot about some of these guys. Bruce Naramore, you heard about the Naramores? Bruce and Clyde Naramore? They were older. Let's see who I have here that you might have heard of. James Dobson. disciplining your kids. He's a Christian guy who's a psychologist, and all of his stuff is very psychological, not biblical. Larry Crabb, probably heard of him. Larry Crabb, heard of him? Or the Minirth Meyer folks. They used to write books together, then they had a falling out, and now they don't write together. I don't know how that works, but they had a fight, I guess. But there's all kinds of folks out there. Have you heard about, there's a book called Boundaries. I forgot who wrote it. Boundaries? Townsend? Yeah, okay, so you got that. You have the 7 love languages. Heard of that? Pardon? 5 love languages? Only 5? So there's only 5? I thought there were 7. Sorry. I keep running into people who don't really fit any one of them, so I gave them a 6th and a 7th. Right. Yeah. So you have all of these guys, and if you read them carefully, you'll notice that you're not being drawn to Scripture, you're being drawn to psychology. And even people who I think work really, really hard at being Christians in their psychological world, I have never yet seen anybody who brings Christianity and makes that the center and does the psychological part as sort of an adjunct to that, as sort of an illustration of that. It always slides the other way around. So it's because I think God doesn't share his godness with anybody else. He won't share with other gods. You either serve him or you serve them, and he won't be pushy. I don't think. I think he just thunders. I don't think he works. He doesn't play well with others, and we just kind of keep wanting to do that. And I just think this is an area where we can't do that. We can't worship God, the God of the Bible, and psychology at the same time. And it really is another religious system. So, how am I doing? So we have a couple of minutes for questions. I didn't really pay much attention to my notes, and I actually have 2 sets of notes there. Anyway, I have a bunch of stuff there you can read. But I think counseling psychology is another God. And if you read it, I think it's valuable to read because they are very good at describing, but you need to have your thinking cap on when you do it because you're going to get sucked into it if you're not careful. Really, really, really careful. Because it's really attractive and it pervades our culture and our society, every level of our culture and society. And even in us. We saw it when I said, what's a guy that drinks all the time called? We all said alcoholic. And there's other kinds of things that we do with words that we don't think about that are psychological words, not biblical words. Another one would be, and I use this in here several times, identifies. You identify as a Christian. That's a psychological phrase. Now, it's become one. We identify as a homosexual, or identify as I mentioned, we identify as having the vaccination. It's become a psychological term. Let's see what's in a couple of others that spring to mind that we just use normal. The victim thing, or abuse. We have this abuse culture where people abuse people, and you can be an abuser and you can be a victim. Well, Christians are talking using that language, but they're not. But that whole world of abuse and victimhood are not biblical. It's not a biblical thing. It's totally a non-Christian thing. And so we just have to be really careful what we're talking about and listening to. And Christians are writing about it, and I just think it's really dangerous because it's a God next to God, and God's not happy with that. Yes. Right.
I've really never heard of it until, having grown up in a different place, not Idaho. These things you just described much more represent the counseling that was available in the Christian community. It didn't really point you to Jesus.
Right.
There are so many different ways to get well, and you never really got well, And what is happening here in Moscow? Did I just miss it? Is it in lots of other places in the United States, or is this very unique of looking to the Bible to solve the problems?
Right. We're videoing. Are we videoing this? Yeah, we're videoing this. So to say the question, I'll say the question again: is this happening other places, or is this unique here? And it is happening other places, and it's growing really fast. And lots and lots of books and articles and all kinds of stuff coming out about it. And all of these, most of my notes have references to books and articles about it. there are organizations that the Association of Certified Biblical Counselors is one that has several thousand now folks who are certified, and most of them are. I'm certified by them, so we're mostly lay people. I'm a pastor, and Justin's going to be speaking after lunch, and he's certified with them, and he was a pastor. So it's all over the place, but it is definitely small, but it's also at the same time growing. So the answer to your question is both. it's kind of new, and I really think because of the Moscow, we have a culture and a community here that's kind of unique to other places, which is probably why you're here. I think our flavor of biblical counseling is also different. And I'm not totally sure how, but when we talk about the video we just watched and what I mentioned earlier about a difference, I think that's some of the kinds of differences. I think we have a cheerful, joyful attitude toward God that I don't think a lot of other people have, and I think that's tied. I really think that's tied to our eschatology. Some people think that it doesn't really matter what you think about where we're going to be in the end, but I think how you get there does matter, and I think it's tied to that. So it's growing all over the place, but I think our flavor of it is different than a lot of other places, and it's tied to all this other theology stuff, which is why I talked about it. Yes.
One of the problems I see is that, and I think it relates to having the two different kinds of, psychology and biblical psychology, is that there's so many people that have problems or concerns in that, but they don't really have people they can go to talk about them.
Right.
And I remember a time back when we were at Westminster Seminary, and I would have liked to go to the counseling center because there was a problem that needed to be dealt with. But it was $85 an hour. And we were Westminster students. We didn't have $85 an hour.
Right.
So I called, I ended up talking to one of the students in the program that we knew, and he gave me some counsel, and it was very helpful in that. But if you got to pay $85 an hour in order to be able to get counsel, you're not going to get counsel, then it's not going to help you. So there need to be people in the church who can help people that need it.
Right. Yeah.
And not, I understand people have to make money for a living, but there have to be people that can help people.
Right.
I think God calls us to do that without it having to be something we can't afford.
Right. Yeah. So what she said was there isn't much biblical counseling out there, and when she looked for it before, you either had to pay for it or you didn't have it, didn't get it, and that's true, and we do it for free here largely because I'm on staff with Christ Church. I'm one of the pastors at Christ Church, so I'm paid. We also have Marilyn Young counsels with us, and she's paid, but she's not full time. Although I think sometimes she works full time. I think I overwork her a lot. So we definitely need people to do counseling with us to help in the way that you're talking about. Yeah. And another thing I think if a person who lives far away from here, or even there are times when there are people here that I really, really hate sending people to the psychologists in town. There is a fellow in town who's a Christian man who does psychology, but his Christianness is not really there. It's not really obvious. If you tell him you're a Christian, there'll be some Christian stuff in there, but there also might be something Zen or Buddhist or something else. But he's overwhelmingly a Christian. But there are times when I think getting some kind of help is better than no help. So I would say if you had to prioritize it, go to a biblical counselor and then a Christian counselor and then a pagan counselor. But you just need to know that your help might be for the thing that is, if you're so depressed that you can't get out of bed, any help is better than no help, right? But still, at the same time, you just need to know that when you get that kind of help, you're getting short-term help, and it's sending you in a particular direction. So we want to be biblical. We want to multiply like crazy, like rabbits, and have biblical counseling everywhere.
One of our churches sent our friend to a psychiatrist or whatever, and basically he pointed out to our friend that it was because he was following Christ that was causing all his problems.
Right, and That's one of those things. That's what I mentioned a minute ago. Is, what she said is the psychiatrist said that because you're following Christ, that's the reason you're having all these problems. Yeah, so that's a clear view, a clear example of the difference. So I saw a hand back there. Yes.
You wrote that in some cases you might send a counselor to a psychiatrist to help stabilize them with the use of medicine. Is the goal of biblical counseling to eventually get a person who has been on medication for years to eventually get off that medication to the point where they are relying solely on the Lord and what the Word says? Or is it to get them to a place where the medication is secondary, but it's still, still continues lifelong?
Yeah, okay. So the question is, let me see if I got it right. If I'm counseling somebody who's taking medication, do I want to get them off the medication, or do I want to get them help how to live on their medication to keep them going on it, that kind of thing? Is that right?
Yeah, but the medication would be kind of supplements, so it's secondary.
Yeah. So do I think of the medication as the primary help or the secondary help or even getting in the way of help? Right. So, okay. So my answer is, it depends. So some of these things I think are genuine things. I think there are people who genuinely have depression. There's something going on in their brain that's causing them to be depressed. And they probably do need some kind of medication to function. Right? So I think that's true. But the other 99% of people have other things in their life that we can talk about that is the reason they're depressed. So if it's a person that we talk about why, what I do, and we'll talk about this when we get to the depression one, but what I do is I say, let's take the depression out and set it on the table and talk about it. Like it's not you, it's it. Because a lot of times people will say, I am depressed. And what they mean by that is not just I suffer from depression, but what they mean is I am depressed. I'm a depressed person. I'm a depression walking around with feet and hands. And so I say, let's take the depression out and set it on the table. And then if I can identify why they're depressed, then we can solve all of those problems biblically. And then they're not depressed anymore. And so then they don't need meds anymore. And if it's the case, I send them back to where they got the meds, and I say, talk to your doctor and see if you need them anymore. And if you don't, ask him to wean you off of them. Because I don't dispense them, I also don't stop people from taking them. So if a person is genuinely depressed, and the reason is something like they have a thyroid problem, and the side effect of the medication they're taking for the thyroid is depression, they might need depression medication, and what we do then is counsel them on how to live with those medications that they're taking. I don't try to take them off of them. So that's what I mean by depends. Sometimes they're taking them and shouldn't be taking them. I had a lady one time who was diagnosed with depression after her second baby was born. And I said, so your second baby, your first baby, how did you do with that? And she said, I was depressed then too, but this time was way worse. And I said, and so I said, I've heard that ladies who have babies, their hormones are out of whack, and sometimes they are depressed because their hormones have gone on nuts, and if they can hang in there, their hormones will get back to normal and they'll be okay. And so I said, did you go see a doctor about all that? And she said, yeah, I saw the doctor, and he sent me to a psychologist who put me on antidepressant medication. I said, why didn't they talk to you about hormones? And she didn't know. I still don't know. But they gave her depression medication, and it didn't help. And the reason I think it didn't help, here I am not a doctor, but the reason I think it didn't help was because that wasn't the problem. The problem was hormones. But what they did then was give her more. The little bit you got didn't work, so we'll give you more. And then she went back again, and they gave her something different that just added to the first batch, which didn't help her either. And then after a while, she was but also one of the side effects of all depression medication can be depression. So I think what happened was by the time she called me, she was past the hormone stuff, but now she's depressed because of the medication she was on. And I said, I think you need to go check again and see if taking you off of all that depression medication, since your hormones are back to normal, probably back to normal, will take you off of it. And that's what she did and tried, and now she's chipper and chirpy again, and it's all good. But it's just very confusing. But why they didn't say you just had a baby, your hormones are out of whack, and check that, I don't know why they didn't do that. So, but.
You have a story on the flip side of that too. Maybe you can tell the whole thing. I can remember huge pieces of it. But a woman with bipolar
Oh, yeah, right, yeah, right, yeah. So there are times when people, I think there are, in the biblical counseling world, schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, I am moving in this direction, but largely, even in the biblical counseling world, we view that as an actual physical brain thing, not a mental thing. So I don't think there is such a thing as mental illness. I think there's brain stuff and there's behavioral stuff. And the psychological world would call the behavioral stuff mental stuff. But I want to distinguish between the two. So I think bipolar disorder and bipolar disorder 1, not 2, and schizophrenia are brain problems, and I think they need to go to a doctor that deals with brain stuff, not to a doctor that deals with it as it's a mental illness. But having said that, I would say that a person who's suffering from one of those two things and the medication helps them, and we haven't come up with any kind of a way to help them behaviorally, biblically, I think they need to take the medication if it's helping them as a ministry to everyone around them so that they don't go berserk in the process of suffering from the problem. So a bipolar person, they go manic and they do crazy things. They break laws, they have crazy sex, they do all kinds of weird things, and then they crash and they plummet and they have depression. Some of that's because they're on an amazingly strong adrenaline rush, and then they also have all the guilt and the down of the adrenaline, and so they go to the bottom and they just crash, and it's just awful. And the medication, so here's normal, the medication keeps them here, and everybody hates being here, but they don't go manic when they're here. So, but they destroy everybody's lives, their lives, everybody around them when they do this thing. So I think they need to take the medication and learn to live with that as a ministry to everybody around them. And so we actually have a lady in the church that we're doing that with, and she's wonderful, and she's suffering, and it's really awful to watch her, but she hasn't gone manic for 10 years or more. And we do all kinds of stuff with her. Lots of ladies help her out, and they do stuff with her all the time. And but before she started taking her medication regularly, she was just a disaster. So anyway, let's take a break, and we can talk about this at lunch. Let's take a break and come back.